For over 50 years, the Irish Times newspaper has sponsored the Irish Times Debating Championship. There are scores and scores of teams who compete, and in the final round there are 12 students, 4 of them competing as individuals, 4 two-person teams, and the champions are with us tonight, and we are so grateful that you've come to Spokane to be with us. In the final round of their national tournament, they were negating the resolution, "Dialogue is dead." So they believe in dialogue, as do we, and so we look forward to a great conversation tonight about some important ideas. Tonight's debate is sponsored by Pax Rhetorica, a nonprofit organization dedicated to dialogue and words across borders, led by my very dear friend, Professor Brent Northup at Carroll College in Helena, Montana. It's also sponsored by Whitworth University's Speakers and Artists Program, and the Arguing Bucks, the Intercollegiate Forensics Program here. So let me introduce our guests. So speaking first on the opposition side will be Liam Boyce. He's from County Clare, which is an hour south of Galway, for those who didn't know. And he attends and debates for the University of Galway, and he was the individual top competitor at the tournament. His teammates are Rob Fitzpatrick and Adrienne Ward. Both of them are from Dublin. Both of them are in the Literary and Historical Society at University College in Dublin. Adrienne is studying law with politics and planning a career in the law. Liam is studying politics and economics and law with an eye on public policy. And Rob studied sociology and social policy as an undergraduate. And they've gotten to see Nashville and Denver and California and Spokane, saving the best for next to last. And then they go to Montana tomorrow, and then they will go back home to Ireland. They will be debating 3 seniors on the Whitworth team. So speaking first tonight for the government will be Gwen Skeen. She's a senior communication studies major from Spokane. Speaking second is Dee Janetti. She's an accounting major from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And speaking last is Sarah Mott, a senior computer science major from North Bend, Washington. So the way that this debate works is we are adapting to the style that our friends use back home. So each debater will give one 7-minute speech. The first minute and the last minute, they are not interruptible. But in the middle 5 minutes, they may choose to take a point of order. They will choose to take a question or not take a question from the other side, which we think is really festive and entertaining to watch. Hope that is the case for you. So I will clap at the 1-minute mark. I will clap at the 6-minute mark from folks in that style of debate. At the conclusion of the speech, feel free to knock, indicating your appreciation. Come on in, it's like church, plenty of room up front. So the motion tonight, Whitworth will affirm artificial intelligence ought to be regulated by an international body. So artificial intelligence ought to be regulated by an international body. So with that, I call the House to order. Madam Prime Minister, will you make your speech not to exceed 7 minutes?
I forgot that I get to time myself. Good evening, students, friends, family, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the 2025 International Irish Debate. To prepare for this debate today, I actually went to O'Dottery's, an Irish bar and grill, to see what the Irish are all about. I would like to first thank our coaching staff very much for being able to host this, my teammates for their hard work, and actually a big thank you and congratulations to our new friends. All right, let's go ahead and get started in today's resolution. AI ought to be regulated by an international body. Our first idea that we'll be discussing is the harms of not regulating AI. Unregulated artificial intelligence presents a serious and escalating threat to privacy, cybersecurity, and global ethical standards. Without an international regulatory body, nations are left to operate in isolation, companies face no accountability, and individuals are left vulnerable to a large-scale harm.
Point of correction?
Yes,
Can countries not regulate themselves?
they can, but it's better when there's an international body to have that standard across the board. Which gets into my first point of a harm is actually privacy violations and security risks. Unregulated AI systems have already caused significant data breaches and privacy invasions. We can see that this significant data breach happened according to ARC Trust in 2023. 40% of organizations surveyed said that they actually had a data breach due to increased use of AI. And those breaches involved personable, identifiable information. Think about it like this. The hackers may have access to your search history, where you may have looked up at 1 a.m., why am I addicted to eating cheese? But what's crucial to understand here is that these breaches did not actually violate any international law, because there is no international law involved. AI-specific cybersecurity does not exist, so hackers thrive in this confusion and exploit the gaps between nations' policies. Without an international body to establish minimum standards, companies have no incentive or obligation to actually uphold these ethical standards. The next part we're going to be talking about under the harms is going to be inadequacy of the current regulatory actions. The status quo is insufficient. As of early 2025, only 15% of countries or territories have enacted legally binding AI-specific legislation. That means the overwhelming majority of the world has little to no regulation regarding AI. Take Microsoft, for example. In 2024, employees staged a protest against the company's alleged involvement in supplying AI tools to the Israeli military. They worried that these operations would continue to contribute to human rights violations. The big picture here in the issue that highlights a key point. Without international AI regulations, tech giants can deploy powerful tools in conflict zones with no external insight. Next harm we're going to be talking about today is the escalating risk of cyber attacks. Geopolitical instability and rapid AI development have created the perfect storm for cybersecurity. Yeah?
Of the regulations that does exist, most of them have a carve-out for military attacks, so why do you think any regulations that would be passed by an international organization would make the same carve-out?
Right, we're going to get to that in my second idea for today of ways we can actually regulate and how it affects global military policies. The World Economic Forum reported that 93% of cybersecurity experts anticipated a major cyber event happening within the next 2 years, meaning that harm of having increased cyber attacks due to AI is increasing. And these are the same experts that actually predicted COVID was going to happen. And I don't know about you guys, but I've had enough once-in-a-lifetime activities to fulfill my whole life. So by 2025, the World Economic Forum actually noted that the situation will worsen. 54% of large organizations now cite supply chain interdependence as the biggest obstacle in cyber resilience. 1 in 3 CEOs list cyber espionage and intellectual property theft as a top concern. And 66% of organizations expect AI to significantly affect cybersecurity, but only 30% of them actually have security measurements put into place. Thus, the lack of regulation leads the open door to a use of malicious AI tools, inconsistency in security standards, as well as delayed and disjointed regulation and response time to the ever-evolving AI threat. So now we're going to get into our second idea today, is going to be what are the ways that we can actually regulate AI. Let's go ahead and get into what it means to regulate something. The textbook definition of regulation is regulations or rules made by a government or another authority to actually control the way something is done or the way people behave. So the emphasis here today is not what is being done, it's how it's being done. We're looking at the how and the ethical implications of this, and that is why it needs to be regulated on an international level. According to the UN, they have recommended an independent international scientific panel on AI. They would meet twice yearly in an intergovernmental and a multi-stakeholder policy dialogue on AI governance to share best practices and have a global fund for AI to bridge the digital divide. The group also stressed that any deployment of AI in military settings must comply with international humanitarian law. Going back to what my opponent on the other side brought up about the military presence, With the UN's actual policies of putting in this, we would see that any deployment in military settings would have to actually comply with international humanitarian law. We can also see that human rights standards and recommendations that establish robust legal frameworks and oversight mechanisms. It's about creating AI technologies that not only advance our capabilities, but also address ethical concerns, particularly with regard to bias, transparency, and privacy. We are not trying to stifle innovation, but rather help the people behind it. They will need to implement a risk management system, confirm higher data standards, and more thoroughly document systems, and enable human oversight to ongoing monitoring. The result is that AI systems will be regulated products that will be documented, assessed, monitored on their own, rather than just evaluating the broader function after the fact. Taking together these recommendations, call the UN member states to lay foundations for the first globally inclusive architecture for AI governance.
Thank you. Mr. Leader of the Opposition, will you make your case for the speech not to exceed 7 minutes?
Firstly, I'd just like to thank Whitworth for hosting. It's been fantastic so far. You've been great hosts. I'm happy to be here. Friends, I know it's a cliche, but it possibly has never been more true that the world stands at a crossroads. The decisions our nations and blocs take now will be exceptionally consequential for the future of humanity. The motion before us today is one which requires a critical analysis of both the nature of AI as well as the values and priorities of all of the world's nations. Today, Team Ireland will oppose the motion that AI ought to be regulated by an international body, and we will do so through 2 main points. Firstly, I will discuss how handing over control of AI regulation to an international body is both impractical and unnecessary, and how a fundamental gap in priorities between nations makes effective regulation impossible. Then Rob will discuss how the segmentation of AI regulation enhances innovation of artificial intelligence internationally. Finally, our team captain, Shining Light Adrienne, will provide summary and rebuttals to the points made. Firstly, I would like to say that there has been valid points made so far by the proposition. We agree that AI poses dangers. We're absolutely in agreement on that. But the question is how we regulate it effectively. There's an old saying that the US innovates, China imitates, and the EU regulates. And it's extremely true in the case of AI. The reality before us is that there is an irreconcilable chasm of values between the biggest powers when it comes to AI regulation. The European Union has consistently emphasized appropriate and proportionate regulation of AI to protect its citizens, whereas the United States has instead chosen to focus on what it calls innovation above all else. In the case of China, it is unclear whether they are being entirely honest about their capabilities in AI, as well as their willingness to regulate. It is completely within those countries' prerogatives to pursue different goals in this area, but that is precisely the reason why we cannot collaborate effectively on AI regulation. The evidence of the gap in values is stark, and I'll use the EU and the US as an example. On data protection, the European Union has demonstrated a commitment to data protection, both through the AI Act, which regulates on a risk assessment basis. AI with a high risk of social harm requires more regulation, and AI with a lower risk requires less regulation. On GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which is a comprehensive data protection package proposed by the European Union. It can be annoying as a European citizen, certainly as one that's involved with university societies, but we believe it's worth it for protection. It demonstrates that the European Union is willing and capable of effective regulation. It has demonstrated its intention to regulate. Thierry Breton, the Internal Market Commissioner, has said that Europe is now a global standard setter in trustworthy AI. The United States, on the other hand, for example, J.D. Vance has said at the Munich Security Conference, he's called for more innovation in artificial intelligence, and that, of course, is code for less regulation. He's heavily criticized the European Union and has said that they are a stifling enterprise. He has said that the AI future will not be won by hand-wringing about safety. The United States has more billionaire influence in government. If you saw the front row of the inauguration, you would have seen Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos in the front row. All billionaires who have clashed with European regulators in the past. Data protection commissioners have heavily fined the United States tech giants. For example, the Irish Data Protection Commissioner has fined Facebook €1.2 billion in May 2023 for transferring data improperly, €251 million for a data breach in December 2024, and in September 2024, €91 million for improperly storing passwords. It's clear that, at least with the current administration in power, the United States are not interested in effective data or AI regulation. There's a fundamental disagreement between the United States and the European Union. That would be fine if they were pursuing separate policies, but the reality is the proposition or the affirmation are proposing a merger of those policies into one. It is clear to us that the different values and priorities of the world's nations and blocs, those being mainly the EU, US and China, mean that it simply will not work.
Point of information,
Yes?
wouldn't a merger mean holding the US to higher standards and that meaning it better for everyone else?
The reality is that it's not a question of higher or lower standards, it's a question of priorities of different administrations. So the US has made the decision completely within their prerogative to pursue an innovation-based strategy. The European Union has instead decided to pursue more regulation. And that's completely fine, and it's not a question of standards, but it is a question of those two countries just simply cannot reconcile their different views on it. It's clear also that there is now great distrust between the world's nations. The change of administrations and constant change of US administrations bring huge swings in policy priorities. The EU, China and the rest of the world just cannot be expected to deal with this from the world's biggest superpower, especially when it comes to the crucial issue of AI regulation. We of course have the trade war. Trump has now imposed tariffs on everyone. The EU 20%, UK 10%, and now, midnight tonight, China will be 104%. Which again is fine, but it is clear that there's a lack of trust between these nations.
Point of information.
No, thank you. That brings me on to my next point. Setting aside values, setting aside priorities, mutual distrust, tariffs, and shifting global allegiances, look at the practicalities. The US, China, EU, Russia, etc. cannot agree on anything, never mind to say artificial intelligence regulation. Does the affirmation genuinely believe that you can get the administrations of Trump, von der Leyen, Putin, Xi, and the rest of the world together, and that they would effectively regulate AI in any meaningful way? It is a textbook example of wishful thinking, and it's not going to work. Also, by creating the body, you're creating an entirely new bureaucracy with new staff, a new building, new equipment, etc., which is entirely unnecessary. AI is easily segmentable by country. It is not like climate change, it's more akin to social media. And so, to conclude, it is abundantly evident that AI does pose significant dangers, but that does not require the creation of a supranational bureaucracy to regulate us. Rob and Adrienne will continue the arguments for the opposition later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, a member of the government.
I would once again like to thank everyone for being here. We truly appreciate it. Also, our Irish team, we love debating you guys. I'm sure this is going to be a very informative debate round. To provide a quick roadmap of what I'm going to be doing in this speech, I'm going to touch upon some of the things provided by our opponents here, and then go through some more ideas, further reiterating the idea that AI should be regulated internationally. Let's go into some of the ideas that our opponents have brought up regarding how the world is divided, and how only powerful countries within our world are making the decisions rather than other countries that are being significantly disadvantaged. And that is why exactly we need an international body governing it, because there are a lot of countries getting the short end of the stick while other powerful countries are reaping the benefits. We're going to see why this is essential more so in the other ideas that I'm going to bring up. Let's go to the second thing that my opponent has brought up regarding the idea of practicality. Sure, some countries, such as powerful nations, might not agree with ideas that are brought up internationally that are beneficial, but they're going to be required to abide with this, because not only is this touching economic gains that they're having, but it also includes humanitarian issues that need to be respected all over the world. Not just small countries that are affected by it, but also powerful nations that reap the benefits of taking advantage of disadvantaged individuals. Let's go into some of the ideas that I have today, with the first one being, or in addition to the two ideas that my opponent has brought up, the third one being why international regulation is essential, as opposed to countries specifically regulating their international or AI issues. Artificial intelligence is not confined by borders, and unfortunately, its consequences the same way. From economic inequality to data exploitation, AI poses global risks. No, thank you. National approaches, no matter how advanced, will always fall short without a unified international framework. We will see how this is the case through two main points. First, with the idea how global problems need global solutions. Because it is a global issue, we need to globally come together to address the crisis at hand. A 2024 United Nations report warns that large part of the world, especially the global south, are being left out of AI governance entirely. And this is brought up by my opponent in their first speech. Further reiterating the idea that while just 7 wealthy nations, such as US, France, and Japan, are members of the most major AI initiatives, around 118 countries have no seat at the table. This is not symbolic. It is in fact systematic. If the same few nations make the rules, the rest of the world is left to live with them, without input, protection, or benefits. International regulations, sure.
Won't an international body just be dominated by the most powerful countries, and it will be an imposition of those values?
Great question. Great question. Like my debate partner have mentioned, this international body is made up of other nations or nations across the world representing their own country. That is why we're going to be able to hear the voices of everyone, every country, even those that are disadvantaged. Let's go into this idea of how exploitation of data infrastructure in the global south is prominent today. Nowhere is this inequity more visible than in how data centers are being deployed in Africa and other undeserved regions. While companies such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google, you name them, are rapidly building cloud infrastructure across Africa, the benefits are not being spread in a correct or equitable way. For example, Africa only gets 10% of the revenue, despite offering over 30% of infrastructure needed for making or acquiring AI. These companies extract data, profit from it globally, and offer little return to local communities. Meanwhile, the governments hosting this infrastructure often lack the legal or technological tools to hold them accountable. This means that because they don't have the ability to control these powerful companies, they're getting the short end of the stick. For instance, in countries such as Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, key tech hubs in Africa, there are few AI-specific protection for users and no binding agreements to ensure the local population benefits from their own data. A researcher regarding this issue actually claimed that global corporations get the data, the profits, and the power. African nations, they get the risks, the price, and the exclusion. This is a significant thing to think about, and that is why we need an international regulation body looking over these issues, making sure that benefits are equitably shared. No, thank you. Idea 4, the economic case for international AI regulation. Let's go to this idea of how AI is going to actually help economies. Improved collaboration, the first idea of that of being under this contention, or idea being the improved collaboration spurs innovation and market growth. International regulation would establish a shared language, enabling seamless cross-border collaboration, especially in high-impact sectors such as medical AI. According to the regulatory affairs, while AI is globally acknowledged as a concern, few formal international commitments exist. This lack of alignment stifles innovation. So we can see that this is a direct harm. Because there is no global ideas or global regulations set in place, innovation is one, stifled, and two, more importantly, a lot of countries are getting disadvantaged. The same source states that we have so much untapped potential because our lack of communication internationally, and there's a lack of communication internationally, and that needs to be brought up by regulations. Let's go into this idea of how regulation builds trust. And trust fuels investment. When people trust AI systems and believe they're governed fairly, they're more likely to adapt and invest in them. Regulations become a catalyst for market expansion. The UK AI Council said, the UK will only feel the full benefits of AI if all parts of the society have full confidence in the science, technology, and the governance that enables them. Because people believe in things that are regulated, the more AI is regulated, the more people are likely to use it. That means there is increase of revenue for all parties involved. Let's go into this idea of how it prevents trade barriers and market fragmentation. Without international alignment, every country builds its own rule, creating a regulatory minefield for companies trying to operate globally. The World Economic Forum tells us that fragmented and divergent requirements regarding AI could increase cross-border trade frictions and create barriers to the use of technology. This is a direct harm. Because we don't have a language that transpires over all countries, because of that issue, there would be fragments and divergence within requirements within these nations, having a direct disadvantage. So we can see here how regulations don't kill innovation. In fact, they increase innovation because people are more likely to trust things that are regulated, that the government oversees, making sure that their data is safe and what they use is regulated by the government.
Thank you. Mr. Member of the Opposition, will you make your case?
I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank everyone very much for hosting us here. It's greatly appreciated, and it's been a really great time in Whitworth. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to do is push back against what we heard from the affirmation side regarding the idea of economic benefits. Because what they fail to recognize is that if Liam's point is true, which they haven't responded to in regards to it being impossible to actually enforce regulation, then they aren't able to get the economic benefits that they talk about. So in order for that point to stand, they must respond to Liam, which they don't do. But given what Liam has said about the efficaciousness of the bureaucracy and how this is likely going to be both a waste of time and resources due to the lack of agreement among nations, we think that it is far more likely that this is going to cause an economic harm. I'll later talk about how we are able to get economic benefits on our side of the house. What I'm going to do is talk a bit about why it is the case that it is more difficult to enforce international regulation. The first is that when there are more countries, there are more voters, and there are more legal systems that you have to adhere to and get expertise on. What this means is that you must get expertise and consensus among a lot of different lines, which is very difficult, because oftentimes countries have very different legal systems or very different voters who actively want different things. So for example, within an American context, they'd be more likely to vote along the lines of wanting innovation, whereas in Europe, they're more likely to vote along the lines of regulation. So on the comparative, when you don't have this regulation or this international body, national governments just have the expertise in order to enact the policies that work best for their own countries. They have the expertise to enact policies that best align with their own legal systems, and therefore are able to get regulation passed quicker and regulation put in place that is going to be more effective for the relative AI industries that exist within their own countries, meaning that we're actually able to get a far more effective regulatory system in place for AI for individual nations. But I think another misconception that's brought up is the idea that countries are going to have to go alone, and this will prevent countries from working together. But blocks exist and regulate together. So for example, the European Union regulates together, so there are multiple different countries that exist within the European Union that align along these same ideals. But those ideals are not the same as America, or for example, the African Union, which may also align along different ideas about what it is that they want to do. But the second thing that I want to talk about is enforcement. Because there is a pushback from the affirmative side regarding the idea that now you are going to be able to hold large countries to account that historically have taken advantage of developing nations. But I'm unsure as to how it is the case that we are actually going to enforce these regulations upon countries, or who it is that is going to pick what it is to regulate. Because usually when these sort of organizations are set up, they're set up with the backing of large countries that have a lot more money and a lot more capital, and a lot more investment within these organizations, so they're able to make the rules suit them. This has happened in places such as the WTO, the IMF, and the UN, whereby colonialist ideals are put into the UN in order to ensure certain development is done within the ideals of Western nations. The same within the IMF, whereby countries have to adhere to certain monetary policies in order to get things like loans. And so I'm unsure as to whether or not this is actively going to benefit these developing African nations so much, given that they likely just don't have as much political capital or money to put in place in order to shape them in this way. But on the comparative on our side of the house, when they're able to put in place their own regulation, they're able to tailor it into the way that is going to best suit them in order to prevent the type of being taken advantage of with things such as data centers being put within their nations.
Point of information,
Yes.
is AI used across continents?
AI is used across continents. However, it is easy to block AI, like it is easy to block social media. But it's not like global warming, where one effect in one nation will then directly affect another nation miles away, and so you have to have a global network in order to do it. Because within AI, you're able to block AI systems from existing within other nations. This happens in Europe at the moment, whereby the Meta's AI system that exists on things such as Facebook and Instagram just isn't a feature in Europe on those apps because it isn't legal within Europe on those apps. The development of certain types of AI can't happen in Europe because of the regulations that Liam talked about. So those sort of developments don't happen in Europe. However, they do happen in the US. And so while it does happen across the world, it is easy to regulate and put into certain spaces. But we also think that it's very difficult to enforce because countries don't have jurisdictions over other countries or authority elsewhere. And because of complex intergovernment relationships, it's very difficult to actually hold governments to account if they do break these AI rules. So for things such as fines or tariffs, it's oftentimes hard to put those in place if you're reliant in other ways on those countries for things such as trade or certain goods. On the comparative, when you are only controlling your internal country, when you're only controlling the enforcement within your own country, it's far easier to do that because you have full, oftentimes centralized control over what it is that businesses are allowed to do in your country, over what it is that your citizens are allowed to access. And so what that means is that you're just better able to enforce any type of regulation that you do have. I think that what this means is that we are just better able to show that we are getting efficacious regulatory policy on our side of the house, and which means that we are better able to get good policy on our side of the house, regardless of what that policy may or may not be, depending on the priorities of each country. But then secondarily, I'm going to talk about innovation and how it is that we get economic benefits on our side of the house. Because if there is a one-size-fits-all regulation for nations, it prevents countries from using their regulations, the regulations they want to put in place, as a competition mechanism. So for example, countries who want to gain investment are able to tailor their regulations or lower requirements in order to attract companies to set up in their nations. This is good because firstly, it increases the ability to get large amounts of money to nations looking to grow industries or get FDI if they have the workforce and resources in order to do so. On the comparative, they now have to compete with richer countries who also have the same regulations, and so they don't have an ability to compete in that way. The second is it increases the types of uses of AI and allows different groups to go in different directions. So for example, if something is illegal in Europe, then it requires companies to try and utilize AI in a different way, meaning that we just have more discoveries about what the capabilities of AI is, rather than one regulation that forces people to, and people who are investing into one certain type of investment. But thirdly, it provides regulatory sandboxes whereby we're able to find out what type of regulations are most efficacious and necessary on a global scale. And once countries are able to view what other countries are doing, recognize that their regulations are really efficacious, they are able to adopt them. One size fits all prevents us from discovering those things as soon. For all of those reasons, please vote for Team Ireland.
Madam Member of the Government, will you make your case?
final thank you from the Whitworth team for being here. When looking at this topic today, I want to boil down a few core things I want you to take away. First, that regulation is absolutely necessary. And I believe this is something that both sides have agreed to. But my opponents are advocating for this idea that we should only be regulating on a national scale. However, we're going to see in the second principal idea that because this is an international problem, we need an international solution. That is not to say that individual countries can't also regulate as well, but there has to be a minimum standard in order to keep countries accountable for the products that they are creating, considering the mass potential for damage that they have. Which is the third core idea I want you to take away. That the current system contains all of the harms that we've mentioned. The fact that there's an increased risk for cyber attacks. That privacy is becoming more of an issue than ever before. That left unbridled, we can see innovation taking off in a direction that will lead to the degradation of human rights. So for these reasons, we can see that we need an international solution, we need international regulation. With that, let's look into a few quick responses to what my opponents have said. First of all, this core idea of the fact that international organizations can't regulate. We can't agree. I'm going to disagree with this for a few core reasons. First of all, we do it all the time. Yes, it's more difficult, it's not as streamlined because you are bringing together people from different places around the world. But we do this. We've seen this in instances like the World Trade Organization. We've seen this in instances like the International Civil Aviation Association, the international humanitarian law that we have, and the international courts, yes.
All of these were set up at radically different times. Do you not think the current political climate prevents stuff like that?
The resolution that we're talking about today is not dependent on today. It is dependent on looking toward the future. We are supposed to take care of the time that we have in any given time. The question is not what is America's political climate. The question is whether AI should be regulated and whether that calls for an international solution. Trump will be out of office in 4 years, probably. In that situation, we need to have this kind of foundation to go forward because the one thing that's constant is that AI is increasing. The use of AI is changing. And while governments can shift all the time as they've done for the years that these organizations have existed where we agree internationally on regulations, we can see that the same needs to be true of artificial intelligence. But more importantly, looking into this idea that because it's improbable that we shouldn't do it, this is entirely flawed. Yes?
You cited, for example, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which took years to properly establish, and the same with multiple organizations. Do you not recognize that artificial intelligence requires rapid regulation right now, which is something that an international bureaucracy just can't provide?
I agree that regulation can take time. I disagree with the fact that it cannot keep up with AI in a way that will lead to help. Because as we can see, things like the EU are also regulating. This is something my opponent brought up. The idea of increasing the standards for testing, documentation, or privacy rights, that is something that can be done regardless of what specific AI is being created. And those are minimum standards that should be upheld. And that's something we see governments doing right now on an individual scale. We have to make sure that they apply on an international scale. Because if we have people like billionaires in America creating technology that doesn't care about these standards, then we lead to the harms that we talked about in our first speech. The humanitarian rights that are being completely disregarded in areas like Africa because we're taking advantage of other countries without regard of international humanitarian law that could be in place if we had an organization to regulate that, to say that they're breaking a standard and then be able to enforce it. The problem is that we're not even trying. And the opposition is trying to say that because it's difficult, because it could take time, we shouldn't do it. This ignores the fact that this is a long-term issue that can create a solution right now that will perpetuate into the future. And that if we don't try, that is when we lose. That is when we fail. Because ultimately, only through having cooperation internationally are we going to create a solution for these issues and create a standard. Yes?
You haven't spoken about at all about what these regulations will actually look like. Like, are they sufficient to rein in these tech billionaires? Are they sufficient to actually protect people? What do you think they likely look like?
They look like things that we've seen in the EU acts, things such as categorizing artificial intelligence into different categories, those that are prohibited because they violate humanitarian law, those that are high risk, those that are low risk, and then you quantify with the regulations accordingly. Things like increased documentation standards, things like increased testing in order to prevent discrimination. These are things that have been done before on a small scale and can be applied on a greater scale. But ultimately, if we're too afraid to even try to figure out how to regulate this, then we've let AI take off in a direction that is unsustainable and will lead to vast harms. Think about it. when we deal with medical testing, when we deal with medical equipment, that is a fast-moving technological progress. But we don't just say, because it's moving quickly, we shouldn't regulate it. What we see is that we have to create environments of testing and documentation that's critical in order to ensure that, say, if a vaccine is created, it won't harm more people than it's trying to help. And that takes time. That can slow, if you will, innovation, but it protects individuals in a way that if we didn't have, could lead to more harm. This is the same kind of concept that we see with AI. And if we have this idea that AI is progressing so quickly that we can't regulate it, then it is progressing too quickly. It is like a car that you are driving so fast that you can't steer correctly. If that is the case, then we need to slow down. And having an international organization is one way to do this. But with that, let's look into the reason why it needs to be international. Why it can't just be national. If we look to the world situation, AI is not just a national issue. It is an international issue because products don't stay in the country that they originate from. They go into other countries as well. We've seen this with Apple, with Google, with AI products of the future. And therefore, if we're to protect people globally, it has to start in global regulation. But more importantly, AI is not just the products that are produced, but how it is done. We see that data centers are being exported to countries that don't reap the benefits from it. We see that minerals are being excavated to produce this AI technology, and it's exploiting the countries that it comes from. The problem with my opponents is that they're not even allowing these countries to come to an international table to talk about this. They're having to push back against countries like the United States on their own, and we see that this isn't happening in the current system. The only way that these individuals can have a voice is by giving them a platform where they can be unified together to create this kind of priorities that we've seen happen before and can happen again. Most countries agree that AI needs to be regulated, and it is about time that we do that we create a safe future for AI innovation that will last beyond the current political climate, that will last beyond the current AI innovations, and will create a sustainable and safe future for the globe.
Thank you. Madam Member of the Opposition, you may do this.
Okay, final thank you to Whitworth for hosting us for the last couple of days. And we really appreciate how welcoming and hospitable everybody has been, so thank you very much. Okay, so I just asked, what would this regulation actually look like? I was told it would probably look something like the EU's AI Act currently. Like, we've given the US a roadmap, essentially. They could adopt this right now if they wanted to. But the reality is that they don't want to. See, we think the ideas that Side Proposition have brought today are wonderful. Like, they're great. And we would love if we could actually adopt them. We would love if we could all sit around and come to an agreement, which everybody would then agree to, and which perfectly balances innovation and regulation, and which reins in tech billionaires, and which is considerate of the developing world. But we tell you that that is just not realistically what is going to happen. We tell you that, like, for example, on January 20th, I turned on my TV to see an image which was equal parts interesting and terrifying. It was a picture of Trump's inauguration, which was littered with tech billionaires. Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Apple's Tim Cook, Tesla's Elon Musk, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, need I go on. This exists in a backdrop of tech billionaires doing everything in their power, from donating $280 million to Trump to killing critical stories at the Washington Post. And this culminated in J.D. Vance criticizing European countries' approach to free speech in a laughably ironic move, for not going along with social media companies' free speech absolutism. Compare this to the EU's approach, where we have GDPR, which is firm data protections, which prevented, for example, Google from launching its AI in Europe. Like, Mark Zuckerberg hates Europe, I'm sure something which Europe takes great pride in. The EU has also passed an AI Act more recently, which we've discussed. This is all to say that we have just very different outlooks on how we should deal with AI than the US, and even more difficult, probably, different than countries like China. Now, this debate does not ask us to decide which approach is better or worse, but we have to acknowledge that these approaches are contradictory approaches, and these outlooks are so contradictory, meaning that our approach to regulations would be contradictory. There are diametrically opposed views about what needs to be
be done in regards to regulation, and compromise just looks impossible. They say these regulations would be great, but they never consider us actually negotiating these regulations. We think in those negotiations, it's probably likely that the neo-colonial legacies that exist in institutions like the UN would manifest, and would mean things like the veto rights that the Security Council have before the UN adopts measures would be weaponized against developing countries, and you'd be unlikely to see the type of regulation that side proposition talks about. Even beyond that, there's just soft power and leverage that exists, which means that countries like the US and China and Europe would have much more of a say in what these regulations actually look like, and would probably continue to ignore the needs of the developing world in these regulations. But I also just think that it is like the international law is the weakest form of law. It is pretty much unenforceable. We see this with other UN regulations. We see this with things like the Paris Climate Accord, which we discussed earlier on today. We see this with things like the ICC. What would happen if countries or individuals break these agreements? What are the consequences? Are we extraditing people? All of this necessarily means that these laws, even if we ever were able to come to a compromise and adequately regulate AI, which is far from a given, would likely be unenforceable and ineffective. And we think, on the contrary, when countries are domestically regulating AI, they do it in line with their own values. They do it in line with the EU's love for regulation or America's love for innovation, and they are enforceable because the people who are in their jurisdiction are bound by their laws. We don't have to consider what the consequences are because it's very clear in domestic laws. We don't have to consider things like extradition because the people are in the country. So I think when we are doing this on a national basis, it is just much more preferable. But beyond this, they tell us that this is an international issue and we need an international solution. I just disagree fundamentally. We regulate social media, for example, on a national basis because we can segregate tech based on national borders. For example, I mentioned already that Google didn't roll out Gemini, its AI, in the EU because it wasn't sure if it complied with our data protection laws. So it is actually entirely segmentable and based on countries. It's not the international problem that side proposition are trying to tell you about. Secondly, they tell us that it's not about today. Trump will be out of office in 4 years, God willing. But I think beyond this, AI is a very, very urgent issue. Like, think about 2 years ago, none of us used ChatGPT, and now, like, universities are scrambling to figure out what they're going to do in regards to assignments because so many students are using ChatGPT. The face of AI is changing so incredibly rapidly that we need to make sure that regulations can keep up with this. So we can't wait for 4 years, unfortunately, and hope and pray that Trump doesn't run for a third term. But beyond this, Liam already told you about the bureaucracy of setting up these types of institutions, how it takes years to establish the UN institutions that they're telling you about, and how this is wasted resources that we could just be spending on directly as nation states regulating this instead of setting up procedures and hiring administrative staff or whatever needs to be done to set up this type of organization. We just don't have the time. I think artificial intelligence will reach the level of general human intelligence by 2030. We don't even know if this international body would be properly established and have passed effective regulation by then. So we don't have the time for this type of thing. They also tell us they changed their case slightly in their third speech, and they tell us, well, there needs to be a minimum standard, but then we would be able to regulate depending, like other countries can pass additional regulations. Firstly, this does undermine their second speech, pretty much all of it. Insofar as, like, they tell us that that regulations are required, like, are meant to be universal to aid innovation. If we're just having a minimum standard and then other countries can pass more or less restrictive standards than that, then you don't have this universal standard anymore. You can't claim any of the benefits of your innovation point. But Rob can claim the benefits of his innovation point, where we told you that when we have different regulations, we find out what regulations are good and what regulations are bad. Because if we just have one universal standard, we don't really know what the other world would look like. But if we have some countries regulating it in one way and some countries regulating it in another way, we can see what works and what doesn't work, so we can actually have better regulation because we can tailor regulation based on the other countries being essentially a guinea pig.
And we think innovation is enhanced when other countries can adjust their laws so that they can attract AI investment if they want to. For example, Ireland lowered its corporate tax rate when we were an incredibly poor country to attract FTI. We think other countries should be able to do this in relation to AI, and so that they can boost their local economies and actually increase AI innovation. So because we don't think that this organisation will be able to pass adequate protections, because we think even if they did, they would likely be unenforceable, and because national laws are preferable, never prouder to oppose.
What a marvelous debate. Did you learn a few things this evening? Yes, fantastic. So, tell me if you were more persuaded by the American team or the Irish team. Perhaps we can do that in the custom of knocking that we've introduced to you today. So, were you more persuaded by the American team? Were you more persuaded by the Irish team? Sounds like a tie. Thank you all for coming tonight. Again, thank you so much to our friends from thank you to 3 senior women of whom I cannot be more proud. Feel free to come up and ask questions of the debaters this evening. God bless you. Thanks for coming.
I know.